Think the 2000s invented terrible cartoon reboots? Think again. The 70s and 80s were the absolute dark ages of animation remakes. We're talking about an era when studio executives looked at beloved classics and said, "You know what these need? Less charm, more commercial pandering." What happens when you take timeless characters and strip away everything that made them special? You're about to find out why nostalgia isn't always golden. The new Tom and Jerry show, 1975. Oh, Tom and Jerry, what did they do to you? The new Tom and Jerry show of 1975 represents everything wrong with network television trying to sanitize classic animation for a new generation. Gone were the explosive cartoon violence, the brilliant slapstick timing, and that beautiful wordless storytelling that made the original MGM shorts absolute masterpieces of animation. Instead, what did we get? A neutered, watered-down version where Tom and Jerry are suddenly friends. Friends. Can you believe this garbage? The entire premise of the original was the eternal chase between cat and mouse, the perfectly choreographed ballet of comedic violence that entertained audiences for decades. But no, the brilliant minds at Hanna-Barbera decided that children in 1975 were apparently too fragile to handle cartoon violence, so they transformed this iconic rivalry into some bizarre buddy comedy where Tom and Jerry work together to solve problems. It's like taking Batman and making him best friends with the Joker. It completely destroys the fundamental dynamic that made the characters work. The animation quality? Abysmal. Gone were the fluid, expressive character movements and detailed backgrounds of the theatrical shorts. Instead, we got cheap, limited animation that looked like it was produced on a shoestring budget by animators who clearly had zero understanding of what made Tom and Jerry special in the first place. And don't even get me started on the addition of that annoying little gray mouse, Tuffy, who served absolutely no purpose except to fill time and add unnecessary dialogue to what should have been a predominantly visual comedy. Tom and Jerry worked because they communicated through action, not words. This show lasted 2 seasons, and frankly, that was 2 seasons too many. The new Tom and Jerry show proved that sometimes, when you try to fix something that isn't broken, you end up with a soulless corporate product that satisfies absolutely no one. The Pink Panther Laugh and 1-2 Hour Show, 1976. Here's a perfect example of corporate greed destroying artistic integrity. The Pink Panther cartoons were originally sophisticated, minimalist masterpieces created by the legendary Friz Freleng and David DePatie. These theatrical shorts featured virtually no dialogue, relying instead on visual gags, impeccable timing, and that iconic Henry Mancini theme music to create pure comedic gold. So naturally, when NBC decided to create a Saturday morning version, they did what any profit-hungry network would do. They completely missed the point. The Pink Panther Laugh and 1-2 Hour Show took everything subtle and elegant about the original cartoons and replaced it with loud, obnoxious attempts at kid-friendly humor. First major problem, they added way too much dialogue. The Pink Panther worked because he was essentially a silent character whose personality came through his actions and expressions. But this TV version had him constantly talking, explaining jokes, and interacting with annoying sidekick characters that served no purpose except to fill the expanded runtime. The animation quality was significantly cheaper than the theatrical shorts, with simplified character designs and backgrounds that looked rushed and uninspired. Instead of the smooth, graceful movements that characterized the Pink Panther's original appearances, we got jerky, limited animation that completely destroyed the character's trademark cool sophistication. But the worst part was how they tried to turn the Pink Panther into a conventional Saturday morning cartoon hero. They added moralistic storylines, educational segments, and even tried to give him a regular supporting cast. This completely went against everything that made the character special. His mysterious, unpredictable nature, and his ability to succeed through sheer randomness and luck. The show also suffered from the typical Saturday morning cartoon syndrome of the era. Everything had to be louder, brighter, and more hyperactive to supposedly appeal to children. But kids aren't stupid. They could appreciate the subtle humor and artistic quality of the original Pink Panther cartoons just fine. This misguided attempt to commercialize a unique artistic creation lasted only 1 season, proving that some things are better left as they originally were. The all-new Super Friends Hour, 1977. Super Friends, more like super disappointment. Look, I understand that the original 1973 Super Friends wasn't exactly high art, but at least it had a certain charm and managed to feature DC's greatest heroes in relatively straightforward adventures. But the all-new Super Friends hour? This was where the franchise officially jumped the shark and landed in a pool of liquid stupidity. The biggest problem with this iteration was the introduction of those absolutely horrible Wonder Twins, Zan and Jax. These two alien teenagers were supposed to appeal to younger viewers, but instead they became the most annoying, useless characters in superhero cartoon history. Their powers were ridiculously limited and poorly thought out. One transforms into water-based objects, while the other becomes animals, but they can only activate their abilities when they're touching hands and shouting, "Wonder Twin powers activate." But here's the kicker. Zan could only turn into water-based forms. So while Jax might become a powerful tiger or eagle, Zan would transform into the form of an ice sculpture or the shape of a bucket of water. It was comedy gold for all the wrong reasons. These characters were so poorly conceived that they actually made Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman look less competent by association. The animation quality somehow managed to be even more limited than previous versions, with character designs that looked like they were drawn by committee and approved by accountants. The backgrounds were boring, the action sequences were static, and the character movements were so stiff you'd think they were suffering from collective arthritis. The storytelling was absolutely mind-numbing. Every episode followed the exact same formula. Mild threat appears, Wonder Twins fumble around uselessly, real superheroes show up to solve the problem in the most boring way possible. Everyone learns a valuable lesson about cooperation or environmental protection. Rinse and repeat for an entire season. And don't even get me started on Gleek, their purple space monkey sidekick, who existed solely to appeal to younger viewers and sell toys. This character added absolutely nothing to the show except annoying monkey noises and slapstick comedy that wouldn't have been funny in a Three Stooges short from the 1940s. The all-new Super Friends hour proved that more screen time and more characters don't automatically make a better show. Sometimes they just give you more opportunities to fail spectacularly. The Flintstone Comedy Show, 1980. The Flintstones in 1980 looked nothing like the Stone Age family we fell in love with in the 60s. By 1980, Hanna-Barbera had been milking the Flintstones franchise for nearly 2 decades, and the Flintstone Comedy Show was the point where they officially ran out of original ideas and started scraping the bottom of the creative barrel with a prehistoric shovel. This wasn't just a simple revival of the original series. Oh no, that would have been too easy. Instead, they decided to create an anthology format featuring multiple Flintstone-related segments, including the Flintstone Family Adventures, Bedrock Cops, Captain Caveman, and Dino and Cave Mouse. It was like they took a blender, threw in every leftover Hanna-Barbera property they could find, added some Flintstone seasoning, and hoped for the best. The animation quality was absolutely terrible, even by early 1980s Saturday morning standards. The character designs were simplified to the point where Fred Flintstone barely resembled his original incarnation. His expressions were lifeless, his movements were mechanical, and his personality was reduced to the most basic caveman stereotypes. Gone was the nuanced portrayal of a working-class everyman struggling with modern problems in a Stone Age setting. But the real crime was how they handled the supporting characters. Barney Rubble, who was originally Fred's loyal best friend with his own unique personality quirks, became a one-dimensional sidekick who existed solely to laugh at Fred's jokes and get them both into trouble. Betty and Wilma were reduced to nagging wives with no individual characteristics or storylines of their own. The writing was absolutely atrocious. The original Flintstones worked because it was essentially the honeymooners set in the Stone Age, with smart, adult-oriented humor that appealed to both children and their parents. But this 1980 version was dumbed down to the point of insulting the intelligence of its young audience. Every episode was filled with obvious jokes, repetitive gags, and storylines that wouldn't have passed muster in an elementary school creative writing class. The worst part was the addition of new characters like Captain Caveman, who had absolutely nothing to do with the Flintstones universe, but was shoehorned in anyway because he was another Hanna-Barbera property that needed a home. It was corporate synergy at its most shameless and transparent. The Flintstone comedy show lasted only one season, and watching it today feels like witnessing the slow, painful death of a once great franchise. Popeye and Son, 1987. What happens when you take the world's most famous sailor and give him a completely pointless family sitcom makeover? You get this absolute disaster. Popeye and Son represents everything wrong with 1980s animation, the desperate attempt to modernize classic characters by forcing them into contemporary family dynamics that made absolutely no sense whatsoever. The premise alone should have been rejected in the pitch meeting. Popeye is now married to Olive Oyl. They have a son named Popeye Jr., and somehow this is supposed to be more interesting than the classic love triangle with Bluto. First major problem, Popeye Jr. was the most annoying cartoon child character since Scrappy-Doo. This kid had all of his father's physical weaknesses but none of his charm or determination. He was constantly whining, constantly getting into trouble, and constantly requiring rescue by his parents. Instead of being inspired by his father's strength and heroic nature, he was portrayed as a wimpy, accident-prone burden who made every episode more frustrating than the last. The animation quality was absolutely horrendous. Gone were the distinctive character designs and fluid animation of the classic Max Fleischer Popeye cartoons. Instead, we got generic Hanna-Barbera house-style animation that made all the characters look like cheap knockoffs of their former selves. Popeye's iconic squinty eyes, bulging forearms, and distinctive facial features were all simplified and sanitized to the point where he barely resembled the character who had entertained audiences for over 50 years. But the worst part was how they completely neutered Popeye's personality. In the original cartoons, Popeye was a tough, no-nonsense sailor who stood up to bullies, protected the innocent, and solved problems with his fists after consuming spinach. He was a working-class hero who represented American values of hard work and determination. In this 1987 abomination, Popeye became a suburban dad dealing with typical family sitcom problems. Instead of fighting sea monsters or rescuing Olive Oyl from dangerous villains, he was helping his son with homework and dealing with parent-teacher conferences. It was like taking John Wayne and casting him in an episode of Full House. The storylines were absolutely mind-numbing. Every episode followed the same predictable formula. Popeye Jr. gets into trouble. Popeye tries to help using conventional methods. Conventional methods fail. Popeye eats spinach and solves the problem. Everyone learns a valuable lesson about family values. It was so formulaic and boring that even children could predict every plot twist 5 minutes before it happened. Popeye and Son lasted only one season, and frankly, that was 13 episodes too many. This show proved that some characters should never be domesticated. The Richy Rich Scooby-Doo Show, 1980. What do you get when you combine the world's richest kid with the world's most cowardly dog? Creative bankruptcy. The Richy Rich Scooby-Doo Show was the perfect example of 1980s animation executives looking at two completely different properties and thinking, hey, kids like both of these characters, so obviously they'll love seeing them together. It was corporate synergy at its most lazy and uninspired. The fundamental problem was that these two franchises had absolutely nothing in common except their Saturday morning time slots. Richy Rich was about a wealthy kid using his resources to help people and have adventures in a world of luxury and privilege. Scooby-Doo was about a group of teenagers solving supernatural mysteries that always turned out to have logical explanations. Combining them created a bizarre tonal mess that satisfied fans of neither property. The Richy Rich segments were particularly painful to watch. Gone was the innocent charm of the original Harvey Comics character who, despite his wealth, remained a humble and generous child. Instead, we got a bland, personality-free rich kid who solved every problem by throwing money at it. The stories were repetitive and uninspired. Richy would encounter a problem, consult his vast resources, implement an expensive solution, and everyone would praise him for being so generous and clever. But the animation quality was where this show really fell apart. Both characters suffered from severely downgraded visual representation compared to their original incarnations. Richy Rich looked like a generic blonde kid in a Little Lord Fauntleroy outfit, while Scooby-Doo and the Mystery Inc. gang were reduced to the most basic, cost-effective character designs possible. The Scooby-Doo segments somehow managed to be even more formulaic than the original series. Every mystery followed the exact same pattern. Monster appears, gang investigates, Scooby and Shaggy act, scared and hungry. Velma finds a clue, Fred devises a trap backfires, monster is accidentally caught, villain is revealed to be someone we met earlier, everyone laughs at Scooby's closing joke. It was like watching the same episode over and over again with minor variations in costumes and locations. The crossover segments where both properties appeared together were absolutely cringe-worthy. The writers clearly had no idea how to make these characters interact in a meaningful way, so they just threw them into random situations and hoped something entertaining would happen. Spoiler alert, it never did. This show lasted 2 seasons, which was approximately 2 seasons longer than anyone should have had to endure this creative disaster. It proved that sometimes combining 2 mediocre things just creates something twice as mediocre. The Incredible Hulk, 1982. Hulk confused, Hulk not understand why cartoons so bad. The 1982 animated version of The Incredible Hulk was a masterclass in how not to adapt a popular comic book character for television. This show took everything that made the Hulk compelling in both comics and the successful live-action TV series, and threw it out the window in favor of generic superhero cartoon mediocrity. The biggest problem was the complete misunderstanding of what made the Hulk work as a character. In the comics, Bruce Banner was a brilliant but tormented scientist whose transformation into the Hulk represented the consequences of uncontrolled rage and the dangers of nuclear experimentation. The live-action TV series understood this, portraying Banner as a tragic figure constantly on the run from both the military and his own inner demons. But this cartoon, Bruce Banner was reduced to a bland, generic scientist who could transform into the Hulk at will whenever the plot required some muscle. Gone was the psychological complexity, the internal struggle between man and monster, and the tragic elements that made the character sympathetic. Instead, we got a boring superhero who happened to be green and strong. The animation quality was absolutely atrocious, even by early 1980s standards. The Hulk's character design looked like a rejected concept from a children's toy commercial. Bright green, overly muscular to the point of comedy, and with facial expressions that ranged from mildly annoyed to slightly more annoyed. His movements were stiff and unconvincing, completely lacking the raw power and animalistic grace that should characterize this character. But the worst aspect was how they handled the supporting characters. Rick Jones, who served as the Hulk's young companion and moral compass in the comics, became an annoying teenage sidekick whose primary function was to ask obvious questions and provide exposition for younger viewers. Betty Ross was reduced to a generic love interest with no personality or agency of her own. The storylines were mind-numbingly repetitive. Every episode followed the same basic formula. Bruce Banner encounters a problem, tries to solve it using science fails, he transforms into the Hulk smashes things until the problem goes away, everyone celebrates, Bruce feels vaguely guilty about the destruction caused. Rinse and repeat for 13 episodes. The villains were particularly ridiculous. Instead of classic Hulk enemies like the Leader or the Abomination, we got generic mad scientists, alien invaders, and natural disasters that could have appeared in any superhero cartoon of the era. There was no attempt to create antagonists that specifically challenged the Hulk's unique abilities or psychological makeup. This show lasted only 1 season, and even that felt like an eternity. It proved that sometimes the most interesting characters are the hardest ones to get right in animation. The New Adventures of Mighty Mouse, 1987. Oh no, they didn't just remake Mighty Mouse. They tried to make him relevant to the 1980s. The New Adventures of Mighty Mouse represents one of the most misguided attempts at cartoon modernization in animation history. The original Mighty Mouse cartoons from the 1940s were simple, straightforward superhero parodies that worked because they understood their own absurdity. This 1987 version tried to add psychological depth, social commentary, and contemporary humor to a character who worked best as a simple, two-dimensional hero. The biggest mistake was hiring Ralph Bakshi to reimagine the character for a new generation. Bakshi was known for adult-oriented animated films like Fritz the Cat and The Lord of the Rings, not children's television. His approach was completely wrong for a Saturday morning cartoon audience. He added surreal visual elements, adult humor that went over kids' heads, and storylines that were far too complex for the format. The animation style was bizarre and inconsistent. Instead of the clean, simple character designs that made the original Mighty Mouse instantly recognizable, we got experimental animation that looked more like an art school project than a commercial cartoon. Characters constantly changed appearance from scene to scene. Backgrounds were often abstract and confusing, and the overall visual presentation was chaotic and hard to follow. But the real problem was the complete misunderstanding of what made Mighty Mouse appealing in the first place. The original character was a straightforward superhero parody. He was strong, he could fly, he sang his theme song, and he always saved the day. Simple, effective, and entertaining. This 1987 version turned Mighty Mouse into some kind of philosophical superhero who questioned the nature of heroism, dealt with existential crises, and engaged in social commentary about 1980s culture. It was like taking Superman and forcing him to read Nietzsche between rescuing cats from trees. The supporting characters were equally problematic. Instead of classic villains like Oil Can Harry, we got weird, abstract antagonists that seemed more like psychological projections than actual threats. The storylines often dealt with themes like environmentalism, nuclear war, and social inequality. Important topics, certainly, but completely inappropriate for a Mighty Mouse cartoon. The show was constantly embroiled in controversy, with parents' groups complaining about inappropriate content and CBS executives struggling to understand what they had commissioned. The infamous Sniffing Flowers episode led to accusations of drug references, even though the creators insisted it was innocent. The New Adventures of Mighty Mouse lasted only 2 seasons, but the damage to the character's reputation was permanent. It proved that sometimes trying to improve a classic just ruins what made it special in the first place. The Gary Coleman Show, 1982. Yes, this actually existed, and yes, it was every bit as bizarre and uncomfortable as you're imagining. The Gary Coleman Show was one of the most tone-deaf cartoon concepts ever greenlit by a major television network. Someone at NBC looked at the success of Different Strokes and thought, you know what this needs? An animated spin-off where Gary Coleman plays an angel. The premise alone should have been rejected immediately, but somehow this nightmare made it to air for an entire season. The basic concept was that Andy LeBeau, voiced by Coleman himself, was a young angel in training who was sent to Earth to help solve problems and learn valuable lessons about life, love, and responsibility. Every episode followed the same predictable pattern. Someone has a problem. Andy appears to help. Andy's good intentions cause more problems. Andy learns a lesson. Everything works out in the end. Andy returns to heaven to report his progress. The fundamental problem was that this premise was completely inappropriate for Gary Coleman's screen persona. On Different Strokes, Coleman's character Arnold Jackson was a street-smart kid from Harlem who used his wit and attitude to navigate difficult situations. He was tough, cynical, and often suspicious of adults, qualities that made him relatable and entertaining. But in this cartoon, Coleman was forced to play a naive, optimistic angel who was supposed to spread joy and wisdom wherever he went. It was a complete mismatch between performer and character that created an uncomfortable disconnect for anyone familiar with Coleman's previous work. The animation quality was absolutely terrible. The character design for Andy LeBeau looked nothing like Gary Coleman. It was a generic cartoon child with wings and a halo who could have been voiced by anyone. The backgrounds were cheap and repetitive. The character movements were stiff and unconvincing, and the overall visual presentation looked like it was produced on a budget of about $12 and a bag of potato chips. But the worst aspect was how the show tried to incorporate Coleman's catchphrases and mannerisms from Different Strokes into this completely different context. Hearing an angel character say, "What you talking about, Willis?" while trying to solve someone's spiritual crisis was both jarring and inappropriate. The storylines were mind-numbingly preachy and moralistic. Every episode was essentially a 30-minute sermon about the importance of honesty, kindness, hard work, and other virtues. But instead of presenting these messages through entertaining stories, the show just had characters directly lecture the audience about proper behavior. The Gary Coleman Show lasted only 1 season and 13 episodes, making it one of the shortest-lived Saturday morning cartoons of the 1980s. It proved that star power alone cannot save a fundamentally flawed concept. The New ScoobyDoo Movies, 1972. Scooby-Doo, where are you? Because you're certainly not in this abomination. The New ScoobyDoo Movies takes the #1 spot because it represents the exact moment when the Scooby-Doo franchise officially lost its mind and never fully recovered. This wasn't just a bad cartoon remake. It was the beginning of Scooby-Doo's transformation from a clever mystery series into a soulless corporate product designed to sell toys and promote other Hanna-Barbera properties. The premise seemed simple enough. Take the successful Scooby-Doo formula and expand it by adding guest stars and making the episodes longer. What could go wrong? Everything, absolutely everything went wrong. First, the guest stars made no sense whatsoever. The Mystery Inquest gang would randomly encounter celebrities like Sonny and Cher, the Harlem Globetrotters, or Don Knotts, who would then join them for their latest mystery. But instead of using these guest appearances to create interesting storylines or character interactions, the writers just shoehorned them into the standard Scooby-Doo formula with no regard for logic or narrative coherence. Why would the Harlem Globetrotters be hanging around a haunted amusement park? How did Sonny and Cher end up investigating a ghost in a medieval castle? None of it made any sense. It was like the writers just threw darts at a board covered with celebrity names and incorporated whoever they hit into their next script. The extended runtime was an absolute disaster. The original Scooby-Doo episodes were perfectly paced at 22 minutes. Just enough time to establish the mystery, introduce the monster, have some chase scenes, and reveal the villain's identity. But these hour-long episodes dragged on forever with repetitive chase sequences, unnecessary subplots, and extended comedy bits that weren't funny the first time, let alone the third or fourth repetition. The animation quality somehow managed to be worse than the original series despite having a bigger budget. The character designs were less expressive, the backgrounds were more static, and the overall visual presentation looked rushed and cheap. Even Scooby-Doo himself looked different, less distinctive and more generic. But the real crime was how this show began, the systematic destruction of everything that made the original Scooby-Doo work. The mysteries became less mysterious, the villains became less threatening, and the character relationships became more shallow and one-dimensional. Fred, Velma, Daphne, Shaggy, and Scooby were reduced to their most basic characteristics and never developed beyond those simple traits. The new Scooby-Doo movies also introduced the franchise's obsession with celebrity cameos and cross-promotional tie-ins that would plague the series for decades. Instead of focusing on creating good stories and interesting mysteries, the writers became obsessed with finding new gimmicks and guest stars to generate publicity and merchandise sales. This show lasted 2 seasons and created the template for every bad Scooby-Doo iteration that followed. It proved that bigger isn't always better, and that sometimes the worst thing you can do to a successful formula is try to improve it. So there you have it. 10 cartoon reboots that proved the 70s and 80s were truly the dark ages of animation. These disasters remind us that nostalgia isn't always golden, and sometimes the past should stay buried in the cartoon graveyard where it belongs. Which of these animated abominations do you think was the worst? Did I miss any particularly painful reboots from this era? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and remember, just because something was part of your childhood doesn't mean it was actually good. Keep watching, keep questioning, and never let corporate executives ruin your favorite characters again.